Welcome to Pathways, Becoming Trauma Responsive, where we explore trauma through a compassionate lens, discover how these experiences affect each of us differently, and dive deeper into what it really means to become more trauma-informed. I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Meeker, Senior Director of the New York State Trauma Informed Network and Resource Center, funded by the New York State Office of Mental Health. The network advances the collective understanding of trauma, wellness and healing, and trauma-informed practices in action. This podcast is produced by CCSI. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the New York State Office of Mental Health or CCSI. Well, welcome, Kahshanna. We're so excited to have you on our podcast, Pathways Becoming Trauma Responsive. I've been looking forward to this conversation with you. And I was wondering if you could just start off by introducing yourself to us.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm really excited to be here. I am Kahshanna Evans, Director of Creating Resilient Communities at PACES Connection. And I also am the founder of Kissing Lions Public Relations, which is my own independent consultancy. And I live in New York City, wonderful, wonderful place, although I need a little bit more quiet and trees in my life. So look forward to the spring and summer to head off into some much needed nature.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And, we really like to kind of hear from people about their journey and how they kind of found their way to trauma-informed practices, kind of what was that spark or aha moment for them. And I'm curious if you could share with us kind of, what really got you into kind of this line of I think it's more than work, right? It's heart work, it's passion, it's, kind of what was that for you?
I would agree, Elizabeth. It is a calling, but I feel it's a calling that kind of manifests in various areas of our lives. So I would say the real catalyst for my interest in trauma-informed awareness was just being exposed to unsafe caretakers who were unable to regulate their nervous systems, and during a time where certain forms of corporal punishment were considered normal.
Right.
And being on the receiving end of things that I couldn't control in terms of harm. Mm-hmm. And knowing as I grew up and kind of did the math and started to kind of really look deeply into my heart about what wounds were left over and where I can go from there, it kept kind of, it was like a labyrinth. It's like you would think it's just one layer and maybe someone had a bad day and now it's fixed now that you're clear on it. But because there's a generational component, because there's a systems component, this kind of, it just stayed in my mind. It stayed on my heart. And not only, surprisingly, not only being, not only experiencing violence firsthand, but really witnessing as a fourth grader where you kind of in the back of your mind, you see superhero movies, right? Every superhero, scene one might be like the superheroes, really taking some licks. But by the time you get to the happy ending, the superhero has crushed the monsters and they're flying high and they might have even met a new best friend, right? Mm-hmm. Those are the narratives that kind of, in the back of my mind as a kid, I'm like, this isn't that.
Yeah.
How can I need some muscles like that hero. I need a cape. How can I get there? And so this really catalyzed me. And I think that seeing not just what people were saying in terms of their own experiences with generational trauma or systemic violence, but I was so fascinated by what people were not saying. Mm-hmm. There are so many generations of people, including and especially women, who were conditioned, you don't talk about unspeakable things.
Right.
And you are being a bad person, even if you've been through something, if you are seeking that truth-telling component and you're looking to kind of say, hey, I want to empower others who have been through this. So I think that was really something that was in the back of my mind I couldn't quite reach. And so I kind of went through several different stages of my career, first in fashion, film, television, and the entertainment industry, then kind of thinking, I just want to focus on well-being. So studying various modalities of wellness, and really finally getting to the place where I thought, I kind of want to do these creative things and I want to do these wellness things, but I also help people in a practical way. Like, I don't have to wear glitter every day to do that. So I think this is around the time that I'd been studying communications, and I took a trauma-informed outreach through an organization called the Connection Coalition. And Terry Cooper Space is just made of magic, and she was really a powerful person, having turned her own life around from adversity, and then starting this kind of trauma-informed outreach program where folks are really looking closely at the history of racism, systemic issues, and supremacy culture, and how we be aware of that when we enter into other spaces where we would like to pour into communities.
Thank you for sharing that. There's so many threads there that I'm trying to decide where to go next. There's so many things. And I think, just in hearing kind of your journey and your story, it sounds like almost like before you had the words for trauma responsive and trauma informed, like you knew it in like intuitively almost just through your own like kind of lived experience. And, I also just appreciate how you highlighted the many layers, that sometimes are just beyond our awareness. So we might, learn that, when there's interpersonal harm, that's a trauma, but neglect to really realize the impact of intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, systemic trauma, and, how those layer upon us and can show up in different ways in our life over time. So I really appreciate kind of how you kind of shared that and kind of how you experienced that in your own journey.
Absolutely. And it, I think sometimes it might sound like, gosh, that's a lot. Everyone can't do that. But the reality is, trauma-informed awareness is really a personal life practice if we let it be. And it's because I'm not here because I'm perfect. My goodness. Let's go ahead and toss that idea right out the window.
Right.
For the audience. The beauty is that when we have a language, a shared language of, typically used terms and jargon, we can actually draw from those if and when we need, but like have really meaningful conversations with team members, family members, loved ones, other people who are grassroots organizers who really want to support, a better world moving forward. We can't have one without the other, right? So when I started studying wellness, it was sort of like, it was very sanitized, and I wanted to be perfect at it so bad. California, everyone's so wet, they're so soft and gentle. I'm originally from Southern California, for the audience listening. And it just became this kind of thing that I started to ask, well, what about all that like New York spice? I've been in New York for like 1 billion years by now. And what about that real talk? And what about that advocacy and that whistleblower? What about that background in the performing arts? Like, how the heck do I start to incorporate trauma-informed awareness and practices beyond the sort of transformational wellness that I studied? How can all of this kind of come together?
Yeah.
And I think that, I was very excited to kind of slowly realize, wellness, especially transformational wellness, including trauma-informed practices, that's not about not being a whole person. It's not about wholeness. It's not about, I'm usually a wisecracker. I'm not going to be a wisecracker anymore. So I think that there are ways that we can just really celebrate that, but not sanitize who we are out of ourselves. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to have weird and silly jokes when we're just with our loved ones. I mean, all of the above. But when we are in these trauma-informed spaces, this is where that oath really, really kicks in, where we know it's not a Saturday in Louisiana. We're in our workspace and we're with our teams and the communities we serve. So work-life balance on this is really pretty important, especially given we all have different lived experiences and we have different national origins, different cultural backgrounds. So some people might crack a beer and have some real talk with their favorite uncle. And others might be sober and might have some of those same discussions with their AA mentors. So, there are so many ways to continue to cultivate and learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I love how you just highlight that it's a journey, it's a way of being, and we're not perfect. We'll never be perfect. And we're going to make mistakes. But to me, part of that trauma informed values is owning when those happen, right. And addressing it in the moment, and repair harm, because that helps us to see that harm can be repaired. There's a way to do that. There's a way to move forward when we make those mistakes. I'm also just thinking about how you kind of shared about trauma informed, and these values can be in all different aspects of community, right? It's not just within the field of behavioral health or just solely in wellness. It really can permeate throughout. And I'm curious just some of the ways that you've helped. I know in your current role, as the director and bringing those resilient community practices, how do you help bridge that into the community as a whole, so it feels something that's natural and not very jargony and, kind of using language that, typically we might not use?
I really love that question, because I have a feeling that really touches the advocate in every listener here. It also touches the real talker, the whistleblower, the folks that are diplomatic because they are working to bring various communities together. I really feel like when I studied, I studied at the Four Winds Society, and this was a program called Healing the Light Body. So I immersed myself into studying shamanism, indigenous culture studies, and this was one of the most powerful times in my life. This is a space founded by Alberto Villoldo, PhD. Your audiences can look up the various books that he's written. But this was really the first time that I was immersed in a community for healing reasons, but I was learning traditions that weren't from my sort of Black and African American side of my upbringing, but this was really, it felt like a deeper recognition. And many folks in the trauma-informed space, as well as the shaman healing spaces, will say, oh my gosh, my soul kind of woke up. And their community practices are incredible. This is, I really attribute the time I spent with the Four Winds Society and various courses to my ability just to start to integrate, what does that look like for me? It looks to me like sitting in circle, which we would do in sort of large conference room. And we'd be sitting cross-legged. Some folks would be in chairs, but mostly we were in a circle together. So circling up and stepping out of this obligation to do every single thing the way that American business practices dictate was really liberating, because I found a lot of my own transformational leadership was really on that level of being heart-centered, and not on the level of this kind of intellectual leadership that for the time that I was a practitioner and studying at the time, it's about real talk, right? It's also about soul talk, that heart-to-heart kind of vibe you can have with people. That's the space that we can kind of just get reconnected to our dreams. So it's not about the fixing mentality that can kind of show up, and it can show up with any of us, myself included. So I think community is about, we have to model what we experience heart-centered to be. And I think that it's going to be different depending on our lived experiences.
Right. Yeah. And, I just love in that example of something that can seem so simple of circling up, and how that changes and shifts the dynamic than having even, kind of a more traditional space in a room where people might be sitting in rows and there's someone at the front of the room, right? It just changes the whole dynamics. And now we're all sitting together and facing each other. And, I think sometimes there's thinking that trauma-informed practices can be really complicated or, kind of take a lot of resource and, but it really, can be a game changer just to do simply something as simple as how you set up a room and create the conditions for people to come together in a different way.
I agree. And, I want to add a yes and to
Yeah.
that, Elizabeth. I feel like there's an intentionality that in a literal room with us or in a digital space with us, where, what I love about the PACES movement is that PACES science is for everyone. And for audiences listening, we're referring to PACES and resilience science. The acronym PACES, PACES, is positive and adverse childhood experiences. So the idea here is that it's both, looking at relationships in the room and relationships digitally. What I really love about the PACES movement and the trauma-informed movement is that if we don't have relationships, we are all operating in silos. And it really is about reconnecting. So whether we are sitting in rows or a circle, the intentionality can show a room, a relationship, a conversation, a discussion, a podcast. And that's, I think, what makes me really excited. And I would encourage the audience, it's like, oh, all this trauma-informed stuff, I'm not sure. Maybe it's for someone else or it's for an expert. You do not. Mythbuster. Let's do it together.
Yes.
You do not have to have a doctorate, a bachelor's, an AA to learn about trauma-informed awareness. It's for everyone. You can take it brick by brick, read little bits. There's some wonderful podcasts, audiobooks, and books in print out there. And so let it be a love language and take your time. But with that intentionality, you start to realize it's not someone else's burden to lift. It's for all of us to lift each other up and to move one another, and especially impacted communities forward, to make sure we're reintroducing equity.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's just a great segue. I sometimes when I'm doing this work, you hear about people having trauma-informed practices and then they have equity practices, and they're almost talking about those as they're two separate initiatives. I've really found that you can't have one without the other. And I'm curious just your approach to kind of bringing those two things together in your own work and when you're working with other communities.
Yes. I know that I first want to really give some praise to the academia community, where their whole entire job is to drill down and define with specificity. And I know that is the expectation in professional spaces. I would say in trauma-informed spaces and social justice spaces, the work that I've done for the last year with PACES Connection really emphasizes PACES and resilience science. And that brings along anti-racism and social justice work. So one of the beautiful things about that is it's really creating some introductory language even for folks in academia who might have a doctorate, a master's, 2 masters, or are just well-versed in certain areas of trauma-informed awareness, but maybe we're not aware of the criminal justice, climate justice, social justice components. I think, you're right. You can't have one without the other. But I believe that if each of us are in that space of self-care and self-awareness, we understand how significant wholeness is. And we're going to do things like power shifting to ask important questions when we are in, grassroots organizations and we're joining community efforts, so that we understand what the organizations are aiming to do and accomplish. And those organizations also understand our areas of expertise and our recommendations so far as heart-centered healing, right? So we often hear people are speaking about equity, but then they're like, oh, this heart-centered healing stuff. Yeah, I meditate, I do yoga sometimes. I want to support everyone and definitely retiring that silo.
Yes.
Right? Equity is heart-centered. Equity and social justice and PACEs and resilient science are humanity. So to tease them out and separate them may be helpful at times. But when we're in a space of integrated awareness and efforts
Right.
to kind of build momentum and organize and mobilize, it is coming from the heart, and it is each of us committed to uncomfortable conversations and making sure that we have a real willingness to educate on little things that pop up that can turn into bigger issues because we weren't able to have a heart-to-heart about it.
Right.
You know, things like in my own experience, like even in the last year, like dealing with tropes. People continually kind of, maybe they just haven't quite unpacked it. But not only dealing with those things like tropes and microaggressions, but when you'll have several folks that are feeling so kind of vulnerable because trauma-informed awareness has this kind of checklist of rules in their book, not quite sure sometimes where to press pause and just kind of bridge like, oh, hey, Tiffany, I just wanted to call out, you know, I know there's been a lot of really interesting articles that people no longer refer to that group in that way. Hey, I'd be happy to send you some articles on that. Right? I think we always fear if we have a coworker in a space of leadership that's saying, hey, I'm not sure using that phrase or that strategy is a way to create a culture of belonging.
Right.
We start to have an understanding of how vulnerable and terrified people can become. Like, oh no, I did the thing. It's like, if you have meaningful relationships and you build those before you need them, you're going to most likely have some really beautiful discussions, tools, and experiences that really help to, on a deeper level, to understand. I mean, everyone feels, you know, oh gosh, I have egg on my face. What have I done now? And at the same time, you know, and I'll take myself, for example, just to kind of further explain to your audience here, Black and African American women in the trauma-informed spaces are juggling a couple of different balls, so to speak. And so we want to be upstanders, but we do also want the security that that expectation is based on those sacred relationships. And so as a leader, if I've been asked to, well, you got to speak on it if it happens and you are in that space of transformational leadership, that's kind of your green light to tackle. But I really feel like we want to really, really be aware of Black women in the workplace, Black women in the trauma-informed spaces, and African American women in leadership, as well as African American women who have a unique multi-hyphenate background like myself. I might be in spaces with academia, but a lot of the things that I've studied and a lot of the skills I'm bringing are because I have studied heart-centered practices, including Indigenous culture studies by way of the Four Winds Society, and, you know, just my own research. So it's very important to just acknowledge that's a part of our journey. And it's important for other folks in the room to be committed to knowing if this is a anti-racism space, in what ways might we reflect on that and be sure that we're moving accordingly.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I just always go back to relationship, and just like, I feel like it's like the foundation of so much of this work, and just, you know, kind of how you were sharing that, pouring into that proactively and, you know, on an ongoing basis, because it only takes, you know, one spill to like kind of dump out that cup, you know, when something happens. But if you've been consistently putting into the cup, you can upright it and then have that conversation that needs to be had and continue to build. I do think unless we're willing to kind of step into those spaces and have those conversations, we're limiting all of ourselves in the ability to grow, right? Because if it's just in here and I'm like, ooh, I'm afraid to say something, we're denying ourselves and that other person. And so I just, as you were speaking, it really, for me, just brought forward that this heart-centered work, it's, can be hard sometimes, but the outcome of that has so much potential for our growth and forward movement.
I agree. And I also feel like this reminds me of something that, for the audience listening, today is my last day at Paces Connection, ending on wonderful terms. And I wrote an article to sort of say, hey, here's a letter from the final letter from the director of Creating Resilient Communities. But I really feel like, you're right. There are those times that we are pulling on and relying on those important relationships. However, oftentimes, and I want to, kind of take us to that level of structure and systems, we can't keep expecting individuals to kind of navigate all of these dynamic changes that are like supremacy culture is like plastic. It is everywhere. We need lots of support having clean drinking water at this point, right? And so ultimately what I'm observing, even in trauma-informed spaces, are that where's the listening tour? Where's the Google form that gets circulated, or the Survey Monkey that gets circulated every month or every quarter, so that folks that might have wisdom and that are they might be introverted, they're not sure, they think they're holding themselves accountable by not centering themselves, but really they don't realize, wow, you have so much power and you gotta share.
Say
it like you see it, and and be able to continue that wisdom. So I really encourage leaders who happen to listen in. The listening tour is important. However you do it, it's important that it's consistent. It shouldn't be a special occasion. I see too frequently, it's like, oh, let's get Steve the bad guy because he messed up. And I'm like, okay, great. But if Steve had a place to talk every month in a form that was like kind of protecting him, he might have been able to say, hey, Jamie is really agitating me and I feel like she's bringing up these topics I don't understand.
Right.
If we're not willing to be a trauma-informed system, we're not going to necessarily see like trauma-informed individuals in the workplace. So I want to kind of manage our expectations and really, again, just build with that innovative freshness. So much opportunity.
And I'm so glad that you shifted to kind of the systems, because we create the systems, and so we need to be thinking again with that intentionality. How are we creating that? How are we building into our culture, our workplace culture, that there are those opportunities for those important discussions? It's not the nice to have when we can carve it in, but it's ongoing, right? And that those are there with intention. I also just want to say thank you for sharing your last day at Paces Connection, part of this time with us today, and congratulations on all the incredible work you did there. I was doing a little research and just kind of the fellowship and all those different pieces, and how many people I think in your time there you much have touched in to build these resilient communities across really the country, and I think beyond that even, it sounded like. So congratulations and kudos to you for all the amazing work you've done in that role.
Thank you so much. And I'm just grateful for every single member. Paces Connection has 60,000 members.
Wow.
We have hundreds of people in our accelerator program and fresh new grads crossing the finish line to the CRC Fellowship. For you audiences listening, CRC stands for Creating Resilient Communities. So, I'm really excited because when I think about purpose-driven work, this is it. I was the sort of chief cook and bottle washer in certain perspectives, and working on the creative side, working on the marketing side, supporting all departments. And I really was moved by people who shared passionately and candidly. Here's what it feels like is stuck in the system. Here's what I like about this. Here's what can change about this. And I encourage the audiences just the way that I encourage the CRC, accelerator participants and fellows. It's great to know what really sparks a reaction in us that we want to see change happen. And it's just as important, once we know that, to be very intentional about retrieving solutions and getting a start. Nurture yourselves by being in grassroots organizations. Maybe that has to do with politics and voting. Maybe that has to do with LGBTQIA plus rights, or, maternal health, which I just wrote an article recently. So, wherever your passion is, it's amazing to feel the fire of, oh, I can't believe this is going on. Encourage folks to use alchemy and get very intentional, because when we are focused, we can change a lot. Doesn't mean we can fix it overnight.
Right.
And I do that.
Yeah, no, I love that advice, and it's like channeling that energy, because I do think once you kind of, your eyes are open and you're seeing things through a different lens, and it could go down the pathway of becoming maybe very frustrating and demoralizing. And I think there's the opportunity, as you're describing, where it can ignite that passion, and when you can channel that, and also then, because I see you as one of those, kind of lighthouses who's like just sparking it from all different people, kind of as they're coming to shore, and helping them find their internal light and pop it on. And, and that's how this movement grows. I feel like, it's each of us kind of finding that spark, showing up with that. And then, then others kind of find that as well. And it kind of ripples from there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's just been an honor. And I do feel that so many years ago, being in situations that I simply couldn't change as a young person, very much a part of my why, with Pace Connection and being in this work is like my sister, who's no longer with us, suffered a great deal during her lifetime. And it was really in this space of wanting to use her voice to make changes. And so as I grew up, I didn't really realize how important that was for me to witness and experience. So not just the wounds, the collective wounds that we both experienced, or individual harms that we encountered, but seeing her, we were at summer camp calling CPS, like, we're terrified. We don't know what's happening. So this is kind of, I'm dating myself, but back when you put dimes in the payphone, and all the camp counselors that put their dimes together, I love you so much. And I will never, ever forget the time that Kimberly Renee Neal was in those beginning stages of just being this dynamic voice of protecting herself and that leader. So that's very much why I also wanted to pour into the culture, especially this last year, through Paces and Resilience Science.
Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing that and that story. And again, thinking about those seemingly small actions that can have so much impact, and, kind of the pulling together of those dimes, but that also created that ability for your sister to tap into her voice and agency to do something. That's really powerful. So, I'm curious, I mean, you've shared so much, and, but, if you had some final recommendations for folks who are kind of curious about this work, or maybe just kind of getting on the path to this journey, what would some of, kind of your recommendations be to them about some next steps that they might be able to take?
Oh, I love this question. I encourage folks to really practice self-care as you begin to organize, as you begin to mobilize. So for example, someone like myself who has experienced feral policing, that was a part of some of those childhood harms. I may not go to marches as frequently, but I'm an organizer. I put those PR skills to the test. And so whatever your style is, practice collective care, as the Chief Visionary Officer of PACES Connection, Ingrid Cochran, always says, as well as practicing self-care. And it'll be the balance of both that I believe helps us to have longevity in our mobilization and organizing efforts. Care for yourself creatively. Creativity, movement, expression is not a nice to have. We need music, we need movement and walks, whether you call it intentionality, whether you call it prayer, or whether you call it goals. Nurture and feed yourselves. You're worth it. And the more clear you are and the more grounded we are when we come together, the more we can kind of get accomplished and really see and hear and be present for one another. So I always love, that part of it. There's amazing practices out there for those on the personal development journey. Being a lifelong learner can only help in this very important work. So I've had the pleasure of working with author Bridget Dangle-Gaspard and creating a free online study course, which kind of teaches us about, to every personality, there's an, myriad of sub-personalities that kind of help us be all of who we are. So we might have the one that's crabby when we don't eat that much, or the one that hears 1970s disco and we just turn into, the class clown imitating our parents' dance moves and things like that, right? So that to me is a really precious opportunity to use your free tools. The Final Eighth, Enlist Your Inner Selves to Accomplish Your Goals, has a great audiobook. So please look online, invest in creativity, movement, dance, yoga, hiking, jogging, whatever those things are. It's very important that we not exclusively live in our mind and in the land of logic. Heart-centered practices are our whole body, and we need others to really activate and keep those spaces activated and safe and nurtured.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I love that. And, I do just appreciate how you just brought in understanding around what self-care is, because sometimes we can kind of portray it as very narrow, but there's so many ways, creativity is endless, right? And so there's so many ways for us to express that and continue to replenish our cup to do this work, because as you shared, this isn't a sprint. This is definitely a marathon, and we're kind of on it, and we need to kind of make sure we're taking care of ourselves. Thank you so much. I just appreciate so much the time that you have given to us, and don't take that for granted. So I really do appreciate and value that, and getting to know you a little bit, learning about your story, and sharing with us on this podcast. As you mentioned, you also wrote a great article for our newsletter on Black maternal health. So I really appreciate that as well. And I wish you the best of luck on your journey, because it sounds like you're at a transitional point as well and some of your work.
Absolutely. I thank you so much, Elizabeth, and I thank the audience. I welcome folks to find me on LinkedIn, Kahshanna Evans. Those of you who are passionate about the work, I'm headed into that space of consultancy, and I'm so excited about the new chapters to come.
Thank you for joining us today. Please visit our website, traumainformedny.org, for additional trauma-responsive resources, events, and training opportunities. Subscribe to our podcast to be notified when our next episode is released.